Good evening. By now, you have probably seen part one of a series of responses to some very serious movements that are gaining momentum in the United States and around the world. These responses are not meant to be universal, but are specifically from the perspective of a Christian. I understand that even that term can simply be contradicted by any number of leaders who choose not to adhere to what I believe are central truths held by the church for the past 2,000 years. Allow me to respond to advocates for socialism and communism. Understanding these movements as they look today will require us to understand Marx. If you missed that, I'll link it in the description. On the heels of Karl Marx's death were a number of young children, some not quite born, who would become enthralled with his ideas of how to achieve a utopian society through communism. Now, I need to clarify one thing up front, and will make a big difference in a moment. I mentioned Marx's anti-Semitism in the last video, but it was more than that. Marx was a fan of Charles Darwin and his theories on evolution. I've got a copy of the book right here, titled The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. I couldn't make this stuff up. Marx was quite the racist. He toned it down in his published works, but in private correspondence, he didn't hold back. In one letter to Friedrich Engels in 1862, he would write, "The Jewish Lassalle, who I'm glad to say is leaving at the end of this week, has happily lost another 5,000 tailors in an ill-judged speculation. The chap would sooner throw money down the drain than lend it to a friend, even though his interest and capital were guaranteed. It is now quite plain to me, as the shape of his head and the way his hair grows also testify, that he is descended from the who accompanied Moses' flight from Egypt, unless his mother or paternal grandmother interbred with a..." Then in 1866, in another letter that he wrote to Engels, "Tremeau proved that the common type is the degenerate form of a much higher one, a very significant advance over Darwin." Please understand that this type of racism is a constant among so many of the leaders that secularists hold in high esteem. This is an unacceptable position for Christians. In 1 Samuel chapter 16:7, it says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart.'" Then in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13, Paul would write to the church in Corinth, "For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one spirit." Jesus modeled this through his daily actions. The church hasn't always risen to the occasion as quickly as we should, but we have always been instructed to do so. Karl Marx believed that communism and socialism were linked, that in most cases it would require socialism to be the stepping stone needed to achieve communism. I'm not going to take time to break down their structures, policies, and plans. While I do believe that understanding how they function can add value, my goal is to help establish the clear points that separate them from the Christian life. The first to attempt this goal of utopia post-Marx was Vladimir Lenin. He saw communism reaching an international level of interest. He wrote in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, quoting Karl Kautsky, The Slavs and Revolution, "However the present struggle in Russia may end, the blood and suffering of the martyrs, whom unfortunately it will produce in too great numbers, will not have been in vain. They will nourish the shoots of social revolution throughout the civilized world and make them grow more luxuriantly and rapidly." The old Iskra, the first Marxist newspaper in Russia, was founded by Lenin in 1900, and it played a decisive role in the formation of the revolutionary Marxist Party of the working class. It was ultimately published not only in Russia, but also in Germany, England, and Switzerland. Lenin believed that small businesses were a problem. He wrote, "Unfortunately, small-scale production is still widespread in the world, and small-scale production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continuously, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on mass scale. All these reasons make the dictatorship of the proletariat necessary, and victory over the bourgeoisie is impossible without a long, stubborn, and desperate life and death struggle, which calls for tenacity, discipline, and a single and inflexible will." He said that victory would require a stubborn and desperate life and death struggle. How will this discipline be maintained? He lets us know. First, by the class consciousness of the proletarian vanguard and by its devotion to the revolution, by its tenacity, self-sacrifice, and heroism. Remember that the proletariat is the working class and its allies. Lenin believed that the people need to become self-aware of who they are in the world, how they got there, what roles they played, and then there needs to be a major devotion made to the revolution. Perhaps something like identifying your privilege and pledging your devotion to the cause as a way of making it right. He continues. Second, by its ability to link up, maintain the closest contact, and, if you wish, merge in certain measure with the broadest masses of the working people, primarily with the proletariat, but also with the non-proletarian masses of working people. Lenin believed there needed to be a joining of like-minded groups, although this was really propaganda, because once he finds victory, he discards the relationships. More on that in a moment. Third, by the correctness of the political leadership exercised by this vanguard, by the correctness of its political strategy and tactics, provided the broad masses have seen from their own experience that they are correct. There must be a mindset that the leadership is right. This correctness is more than ideology. There must be an acceptance that these strategies and tactics are the correct course of action. Without these conditions, discipline in a revolutionary party really capable of being the party of the advanced class whose mission is to overthrow the bourgeoisie and transform the whole of society cannot be achieved. Without these conditions, all attempts to establish discipline inevitably fall flat and end up in phrasemongering and clowning. What is phrasemongering? It is the especially habitual use of grandiose or striking phrases. Lenin believed that without discipline, all you are left with is catchy phrases and silly behavior. There must be order, there must be structure, there must be someone who is central in the movement. On the other hand, these conditions cannot emerge at once. They are created only by prolonged effort and hard-won experience. Their creation is facilitated by a correct revolutionary theory, which in its turn is not a dogma, but assumes final shape only in close connection with the practical activity of a truly mass and truly revolutionary movement. This is a phased movement. If you push too much too quickly, it won't work. It'll take time. Most importantly, it requires the rallying of the masses. This is directly in line with Marxist theories. Lenin was living in a land ruled by ruthless czars and saw so much suffering. He would go on to lead the Bolshevik Party, and with the help of Germany during World War I, they would undermine the war effort and work to start riots in what was called the July Days. This bankrupted the government, allowing Lenin to seize power. They went on to murder anyone seen as an imperialist without trial, men, women, and children. Simultaneously, they turned on their old allies, the very working class they claimed to be representative of, and Christians, whom Lenin had been tolerant of initially. This is the madness of these groups. They feign alliances until a goal is met. Then they kill off those that believed they were in alliance with. Lenin, speaking for the Social Democrats, wrote, "Religion is the opium of the people." This dictum by Marx is the cornerstone of the whole Marxist outlook on religion. It is the absolute duty of social democrats to make a public statement of their attitude towards religion. Social democracy bases its whole world outlook on scientific socialism, i.e., Marxism. The philosophical basis of Marxism, as Marx and Engels repeatedly declared, is dialectical materialism, a materialism which is absolute, atheistic, and positively hostile to all religion. Marxism has always regarded all modern religions and churches and each and every religious organization as instruments of bourgeoisie reaction that serve to defend exploitation and to befuddle the working class. Marxism is materialism. As such, it is as relentlessly hostile to religion. We must combat religion. That is the ABC of all materialism and consequentially of Marxism. But Marxism is not a materialism which has stopped at the ABC. Marxism goes further. It says we must know how to combat religion. Upon Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin came into power. Stalin was raised in a Christian home. In 1895 at university, he began reading the works of Marx and Lenin and would join the Bolshevik Party. It's worth mentioning here that this was no utopia, not just because of the ever-increasing body count and starvation of the masses, but even by the transfer of power. Stalin wasn't the next in line. Most agreed Trotsky would be, but he seized the position by exiling anyone who opposed him. Stalin began an aggressive plan to develop the nation, and the consequences for anyone who did not meet deadlines was either death or the gulags. Millions would die of starvation under collectivism, his way of seizing food for those who were working to do what he wanted. He demanded that people idolize him. His pictures were placed all around the country. In the 1930s, 20 million Soviet citizens were either killed or sent to gulags. Stalin's brand of vitriol is nasty. For our purposes, he is an example of what you have to look forward to with the second generation leader in a communist utopia. Many of you are most likely very familiar with Hitler and the Nazis of Germany. There's no need to document his rise to power here, but I do feel the need to address some disinformation. In an attempt to soften the blow to socialist ideas and philosophies, there is an absurd teaching that Hitler and his Nazis were not actually socialists. This is easily debunked by Hitler's own writings and declarations. But first, remember I mentioned earlier that Marxist racism would play a role in the conversation? Here's the thing. Racism and hate for people who do not think like them is a pretty standard hallmark of the Marxist mind. Hitler, like Marx, hated those who were not like him. Hitler would say, "We are socialists. We are the enemies of today's capitalist system of exploitation, and we are determined to destroy this system under all conditions." This was a declaration he made over and over, like the beating of a drum. Hitler advocated class warfare and wanted the removal of all capitalists, especially Jewish capitalists. The National Socialist Workers' Party, often called the Nazi Party, saw it as the government's responsibility to take over education, transportation, and healthcare. Nazis advocated abortion, strict gun control, and they worked feverishly to control Christians. Hitler was born into a Christian home. Of that, there is no debate. What is of debate is whether he remained a believer. Some of Hitler's aides claimed he told them during war. The dogma of Christianity gets worn away before the advances of science. Gradually, the myths crumble. All that is left to prove that nature, there is no frontier between the organic and inorganic. When understanding of the universe has become widespread, when the majority of men know that the stars are not sources of light, but worlds, perhaps inhabited worlds like ours, then the Christian doctrine will be convicted of absurdity. In his book, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, Alan Bullock wrote, "In Hitler's eyes, Christianity was a religion fit only for slaves. Its teaching," he declared, "was a rebellion against the natural law of selection by struggle of the fittest." However, publicly, Hitler would say, "Today, Christians, stand at the head of this country. I pledge that I never will tie myself to parties who want to destroy Christianity. We want to fill our culture again with the Christian spirit. We want to burn out all the recent immoral developments in literature, in the theater, and in press. In short, we want to burn out the poison of immorality which has entered into our whole life and culture as a result of liberal excess during the past few years." There are many quotes from Hitler around Christianity. If he was not a Christian, then why would he say these things? There's no denying the incredible power the Catholic and even Protestant church movements have had in the ebb and flow of history. The German Catholic Church was no different, and Hitler either needed their compliance or their silence. The real question we need to ask is, did Hitler believe he was a Christ follower? I say that because he was not one, even if he believed he was. The actions of his life did not line up with those prescribed in Scripture. This would not be the first time that someone carried out tyranny under the guise of being a faithful follower of the Creator. Look at Israel's first king, Saul. Saul began as a man of faith, and after countless moments of rebellion and defiance, instead of repenting, he still declared he was serving God. In addition to this special brand of extreme racism fueled socialism, Hitler was a pioneer for the abortion industry. He was an advocate for what was called social Darwinism. This was an ideology championed by the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. In her magazine, Birth Control Review, they would run a story by Ernst Rudin, the chief architect of the Nazi sterilization program. In a book entitled Table Talk, Hitler is credited with saying, "If any such idiot tried to put into practice such an order forbidding abortion in the occupied Eastern territories, he would personally shoot him. In view of the large families of the native population, it could only suit us if girls and women there had as many abortions as possible. Active trade in contraceptives ought to be actually encouraged in the Eastern territories, as we could not possibly have the slightest interest in increasing the non-German population." Can Christianity exist within a strict socialism? Only if it conforms to the demands of the society, and then it is no longer the Christianity of Scripture. It is something new. In China, Mao Zedong was serving as the leader of the newly established Communist Party, which was in control of the government following decades of civil war and 2 world wars. He was no stranger to the fight. In fact, he had maintained leadership roles since the 30s. In 1966, university students cried out, "It's right to rebel," as they marched for what would be called the Cultural Revolution under the leadership of Mao. They called themselves Red Guards, and Mao would begin public appearances blessing these students for their revolution. The Red Guard was given free travel to move through the country. Mao asked the Red Guard to destroy the 4 olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. This gave them free rein to go through homes and ransack them, taking what they saw as contraband. The violence was not long to be directed exclusively at those who would have been seen as the leaders of class opposition. It would spread to their children and their extended family. They would be paraded around and beaten publicly, oftentimes by their own family. It is estimated that more than 400,000 were killed. The military and local law enforcement were not allowed to interfere. communist leaders championed this Red Guard. Mao would say, revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not a dinner party. By 1967, there was a constant call for violent revolution. If leaders stood against them, they were beaten and exiled. Their daughters would be dressed as whores and paraded around, and some would go to prison. This created silence among the nation's leaders, conformity. There were several uprisings, but by the summer of 1967, Mao would call it all-out war and total chaos. Then Mao sent in the military to disband the Red Guard. There were officers kept at the universities to drag off anyone who did not submit. By 1968, the military, under Mao's control, had terrorized the nation into submission. Twice a day, people everywhere had to dance the loyalty dance and confess their thoughts about Mao. Anyone who spoke out was labeled a reactionary. Later that year, the former Red Guard were sent to be re-educated by peasants, those they were accused of having oppressed. Marxists, to this day, praise the Cultural Revolution of China by calling it the Great Leap Forward. It is heralded as being one of, if not the single greatest moment of time in our world. Why? Because the result of the revolution, they claim, was an increase in literacy, life expectancy, and rights among the people. The problem is they do not take into account the technological advances that were being made in true republics like the United States and the openness to share those advancements as a means of helping humanity. Mao demanded that people see him as their God. They were to worship him, singing songs of his immortality. In fact, there were many who could not believe he had died in 1976. Today, Christianity is strong in China, but only because of an underground church, a group of believers who never know what the current expectations of the state will be. Sometimes they are left alone for years. They build churches, they do evangelism, they serve their communities. Then the government will decide they have too much influence and outlaw their gatherings. According to an article from just months ago in Christianity Today, we find that China has ordered Christian villagers to renounce their faith in Jesus and worship the nation's Communist Party leaders instead. Chinese authorities visited Christian homes in Linfen in the northern province of Shaanxi in April and told residents who were on welfare benefits that they had to take down all crosses and replace any displays of Jesus with portraits of Chairman Mao and President Xi Jinping. According to Religious Freedom magazine, Bitter Winter, any Christian who refused to comply with the demand had their welfare subsidies annulled. During the COVID lockdown, many church buildings have been demolished while they are forced to meet in homes. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in a sermon preached in Atlanta, Georgia, "Communism is the only serious rival to Christianity. Other historic world religions such as Judaism, Mohammedanism, Buddhism, Hinduism may be listed as possible alternatives to Christianity, but for Christianity's greatest rival, we must look elsewhere. Certainly, no one in touch with the realities of the contemporary situation can deny that in the crisis confronting civilization, Christianity's most formidable competitor and only serious rival is communism. Let us begin by stating that communism and Christianity are at the bottom incompatible. One cannot be a true Christian and a true communist simultaneously." He said this because he was watching as Mao was terrorizing Asia, but more closely was seeing Fulgencio Batista, the elected leader of Cuba from 1940 to 1944, and then a US-backed dictator from 1952 to 1959. He made Havana the city that we see in old films. It was a playground for the wealthy and the tourists. Unfortunately, he did this by keeping the people in poverty. President John F. Kennedy would say, "I believe that there is no country in the world, including the African regions, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I believe that we created, built, and manufactured the Castro movement out of whole cloth, and without realizing it. I believe that the accumulation of these mistakes has jeopardized all of Latin America. Kennedy was having to navigate the nightmare that was Fidel Castro while coming to grips with the U.S.'s part in how it got to that place. Castro developed forced labor camps, routine torturing of dissidents, and the loss of free speech. He would come to establish a brutal communist regime just south of Florida. He did this with the help of Ernesto Che Guevara. Ernesto was a medical student who saw the oppression of the people and believed that the only real way to help them was to lead them to revolution. He did this with the use of guerrilla warfare and terrorism. I'll be discussing his book, Guerrilla Warfare, which is a manifesto for how to develop an army to rise against the government, in my next video. Were these things he saw bad? Yes, they were unacceptable, and many were the fruits of godless capitalists taking advantage of the poor. The problem that I need you to understand is that the cycle of violence he instituted did not help the poor and oppressed. Instead, it just brought a new disaster into power. The systems of socialism and communism always fail. Why? They require virtue, but they get greed. Milton Friedman, an economist, once said in an interview on the topic of greed, "Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worse off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that, so that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by the free enterprise system. On the topic of virtue, Friedman said, "And what does reward virtue? Do you think the communist commissar rewards virtue? Do you think Hitler rewards virtue? Do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. Just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us." This is simple. We get this. In Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, it says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind." When you remove Christ, there is no other option. Today, this is important because there are networks of groups naively working together for this revolution. Groups like the Denver Communists that are finding an audience with Americans are not allies with the mission of the church. They say, "We are working with other socialist organizations around the country to build a new national organization, which is currently called the Revolutionary Socialist Network and meets twice a month. Our basic strategy is to develop ourselves and others as cadre, Marxist activists trained through collective study and struggle. We are dedicated to the study of revolutionary socialist theory, history, strategy, and tactics. We intervene in social movements and labor struggles to the best of our ability in order to advance those fights and, with our fellow fighters, to revolutionary socialism. We should be aware of what this looks like and the groups they are partnering with. Socialism, communism, democratic socialism, and the like are on the one hand attempting to do many of the very things we as Christians are called to do. Jesus worded it like this in Luke chapter 4, verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. However, these groups, based not only on the writings of their most revered saints, but also by practice, do not see the Christian faith, or at least true Christian faith, as an acceptable part of their societies. It ends in mass murder and executions. It ends in starvation and assault. It ends in a loss of morality and constant war. To those that consider themselves followers of Christ, do not be silent. Do not be ignorant. Do not be compliant. Share the gospel. Share the hope. Be light. Fight for the oppressed. Don't rely on the wicked to do what you were created for. To those who desire a socialist or communist utopia by whatever means necessary, we are not intimidated into silence by antics of hate and destruction. We aren't going anywhere. The battle is won and the victory belongs to the Lord. If this video stirs you, consider liking and sharing. We need to get this message out. Also, if you are able, consider supporting our efforts at citychurch.life/give. Good night and God bless.